Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the HITRUST Assessment Handbook Introduction and Overview. My name is Dennis Palmer, and I'll be your host and your moderator. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to enter your questions and comments in the chat. The presentation and the recording will be made available to participants a short time after completion of the webinar. In addition, we will follow up any questions we're not able to address during the presentation. I'd like to now introduce to you your presenters, Vincent Benekers, Vice President of Quality at HITRUST, and Ida Waniki, Director of Assurance Services. Vinny, let me turn it over to you at this point.
Thanks, Dennis. And thanks for everyone for joining today. This is our first in the Assessment Handbook webinar series. Today, we're intending to go QA processes. So we want to discuss how we're going to approach QA with the handbook out now. And then we're going to go into what are the next steps when it comes to new versions of the assessment handbook and some key dates for you to keep in mind. Dennis, you want to go on the next slide? So the first thing I want to address before we get into why we have the handbook in place is why do we even have rules in place that govern the assessment and certification processes? Well, I think as everyone's aware of on this call, the various certifications that HITRUST issues, R2, I1, and E1, are really great tools for organizations to use to demonstrate compliance with information protection requirements. But one of the key reasons it's a good tool is because of the quality and integrity of the certification itself. And to maintain the quality of the HITRUST certification, it's really important, it's critical really, that HITRUST has and provides a clear set of those rules, and we call them, in the handbook, we call them criteria that govern our assessment and certification processes. Now, we've always had these requirements in place, and these requirements are in place so that organizations can meet the expectations of our CSF, and the requirements are enforced by our assurance and quality teams, really to maintain consistency throughout an assessment, regardless of the assessor or regardless of the organization that's going through an assessment. And we've developed these requirements to fit a broad range of situations and different organization environments. Now, these criteria that we've issued we've provided them in advisories over time and along with different white papers that we've issued. And so the need really came up to provide the community with a consolidated place where everyone could find the necessary information regardless of where they are in their assessment or certification process. And so that's where the handbook really comes in. Dennis, can you go to the next slide? So what the handbook does is really provide further clarity for both organizations and assessors on wherever they are in the assessment and certification process. The intent of the handbook is not to significantly change how assessments are currently being done, but we want to have this in place to make sure all parties are following the same set of guidance and expectations. So what we've come up with in the handbook is a central resource, easy to find, easy to use, so that everyone's aligned on the assessment and certification processes and expectations. So you'll see I the link here to the assessment handbook. You can also find it in the most recent advisory that we've issued on the assessment handbook, as well as from the HITRUSTalliance.net homepage under resources. You'll see a link to the assessment handbook. Now, when you access the assessment handbook, chapter 1 also gives you an opportunity to download a PDF version in case you want to have your own local copy available. So as I mentioned, it consolidates all the assessment processes into a single, easy to find, navigate resource. Since some of the previous guidance we've provided was across multiple documents. We've also updated some of those guidance, some of the advisories that were issued maybe a year and a half or a couple years ago. We've updated any necessary guidance based on the assessment portfolio changes. So you'll find in the handbook information on the upcoming rapid research that's available for an I-1. We've included information on where to find different evaluative elements in requirement statements, depending on if you're in an E1, I1, or different versions of the R2. We've also wanted to include in the handbook a place where people could find examples and frequently asked questions for common situations that come up throughout an assessment. Can you go to the next slide, James? So to summarize some of the chapters in the handbook, we have 15 chapters and an appendix, which you can see here. I'm not going to go through each of them in detail. I do want to touch on a few of these though. So for chapter 5, the HITRUST assessment workflow, this is where an organization and their assessor can provide initially a high-level explanation of each phase in our assessment workflow. We previously issued an advisory a few years ago introducing this new assessment workflow. And what we've done in this chapter is also add references to all the other parts of the handbook where you can dive deeper into that particular phase, depending on what phase you're in within an assessment. If you look at chapter 7, scoping the assessment, we haven't changed the process for scoping an assessment, but what we've intended to do in this chapter is really provide additional guidance and considerations that organizations and their assessors need to take into account as they're determining the scope of an assessment and as they're going through the process of testing each of the individual requirements. And we do have a webinar next week, next Tuesday, that's going to go over that chapter in particular. In chapter 11, testing and evidence requirements. This is really important for external assessors or internal assessors when they're performing and documenting their validation of the organization's scores. It really details out what HITRUST expects from a testing and evidence standpoint. And then going into chapter 14, undergoing quality assurance. Previously, we haven't had a lot of documentation that discusses our QA processes. And so we really wanted to provide a lot more transparency into what happens when you submit an assessment. What processes does that assessment go through, and what questions might you get depending on where you are in the QA process. In chapter 15, this chapter discusses the reporting side. So for reporting and maintaining a HITRUST certification. So it's really everything after you achieve certification, because the journey doesn't end once you've received your certification report. A HITRUST assessment is a forward-looking certification, either 1 year looking forward for the I1 and E1, or 2 years looking forward for an R2. So a lot can happen during that time. You could have significant changes. You could have a security event in the environment. And so we wanted to include information around what you need to do if those situations come up. We also include information there on performing the interim assessment for an R2 or performing a rapid recertification for an I1. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have the Appendix A, which includes those frequently asked questions and examples. That's really important. That really helps an organization to understand further the previous criteria that we've listed out in the first 15 chapters of the handbook. Dennis, can you go to the next slide? So when we look at some of the practical applications of the assessment handbook, I've included here a few of the common questions and the location of those, where you can find guidance on those common questions. So the first, so let's say you're about to begin the first HITRUST assessment. Where do you find information about what your responsibilities are during the assessment process? Well, Chapter 3.1, the assessed entity, provides the roles and responsibilities for an assessed entity. And it's really an important first chapter for any organization to review when they're getting started in their HITRUST journey to understand what will be expected of them. If you're a HITRUST assessor, where would you be able to find more information on HITRUST testing and evidence expectations during fieldwork? As I mentioned on the previous slide, Chapter 11 really goes into the testing and evidence requirements. It includes expectations on timing for your fieldwork procedures, population and sampling guidance, along with exception handling. On the third common question, if you're looking for information on the proper use of inheritance on an assessment, Chapter 12.2 really details the reliance on assessment results using control inheritance. It includes information for both inheritance users and providers. So not just if you're gaining inheritance, you're considered an inheritance user. If you're providing inheritance, then you're an inheritance provider. So we've really detailed out here what the expectations are and guidance for each of those parties when it comes to inheritance. If you're moving your certified systems to a new data center, what would be the impact of that? In Chapter 15.6, we discuss how you can handle significant changes during your certification. We do have another webinar, reporting and maintaining a certification, that will be in January. And in that webinar, we're going to also detail out some more information on that chapter and answer some questions around significant changes as well. And then if you're looking for examples on how to use the rubric to score a requirement statement, well, this is where the appendix comes in very handy. In Appendix A6 and A7, we've included examples for each maturity level, whether it's policy, procedure, implemented, measured, or managed maturity levels, on how to use the rubric to perform scoring. And we've included several different scenarios there and approaches for scoring using the rubric. And it depends on, also depending on the number of elements that are being tested. So now that I've covered some of the practical applications and an overview of the handbook, I want to turn it over to Ida Monique on our assurance team, and she's going to discuss what can be expected as far as the QA approach goes now that the handbook is out.
Thank you, Vincent. One thing I want to recap that was mentioned is the purpose for the assessment handbook, and that will be so important to remember. The assessment handbook is to unify and provide consistent guidance to all stakeholders during the validated assessment process. So the HITRUST QA approach will not be new, but we'll have a few new things you'll see in the next couple of weeks to address the new criteria or requirements that you may find as you review the assessment handbook. So as we get into this, in the next slide, I'll highlight some key dates, and then I'll talk about some of the warning tasks that will, which is the approach we'll use to prepare the assessors for what's coming once it becomes we finish the grace period. So as we had published an advisory when we published the assessment handbook, and the advisory did mention that effective April 16th, 2024, all assessments submitted to HITRUST are expected to observe and follow the requirements, which is the criteria outlined in the handbook. And it's also important to note, and you'll hear me repeat this as I go through these slides, most of them are not new. It's what we've talked about, it's feedback we've provided before, but now it's documented within one reference point, which allows for the consistency with all test entities and also the QA team within HITRUST. So some key dates to note for submissions that will start QA between February 5th of 2024 to April 16th. The QA analyst will open tasks that will make a reference to the assessment handbook criteria. So all the tasks will be mapped to the assessment handbook so that any feedback we are providing you, you have a reference point. The assessed entity has a reference point. For those new criteria items, which is like requirements you may find as you review the assessment handbook, we also do have a grace period through April 16th, and those tasks will be warning tasks. We are calling them early warning tasks. And the next slide, I'll cover that. But before we go to the next slide, I think it's also good to cover what non-compliance will look like. What should you expect as an assessor, and how does HITRUST treat non-compliance? Again, this is processes already in place, but we just want to recap and confirm if there are situations of non-compliance with these outlined criteria within the assessment handbook, then this is what you'd expect. Currently, HITRUST does request the assessor to remediate the non-compliant assessments. It's either we meet with the assessor or many a times you receive tasks. HITRUST may also reject the non-compliant assessment. It can be at the check-in review process, we can reject, so you take care of what is non-compliant, or at the end of the QA process, there are other steps that are taken before we completely reject a non-compliant assessment. But those are the two starting options to that. If an assessor firm continues to submit non-compliant assessment, HITRUST may provide a written warning of non-compliance to the external assessor firm. If this continues, and that has happened sometimes even currently with the current requirements, we do request a meeting with the external assessor firm leadership. And the goal for this meeting is to better understand why we see a trend of repeated issues, even after we've communicated them. How can we help them? Is it an end user training requirement? So we do offer solutions from these meetings. So the meeting is not just to mention the non-compliance, but also to look for a resolution. And then finally, if the non-compliance continues after all the other steps have been taken, HITRUST may request the external assessor firm develop and initiate a corrective action plan where they are providing updates to HITRUST on what they are doing. So again, this is not new, but it's good to remember there is a process for non-compliance as you look at the different criteria that are outlined in the assessment handbook. Now let's talk about the early warning tasks, because that will be what is new and unique during this grace period before April 16th. So from February 5th, 2024 to April 16th, 2024, before we completely expect everybody to meet the requirements within the assessment handbook, we will open some early warning tasks, which is really a notice to the assessor. The tasks will be outlined like the task you see on my right-hand side. So the QA analyst may provide the task depending with what they identify. If you did not meet the requirements, which is what we are calling criteria within the assessment handbook. For already known issues or requirements that we are already pushing back on in QA right now, like if we observe items that will directly impact scoring, scope, or fairness of the report presentation, those ones will still have the normal tasks and must be addressed. Please don't expect you'll get a warning task for those things that you're already working on. So keep in mind items that will directly impact scores, impact scope, or the fairness of the final report, we will expect those to be addressed. So for the few that you may come across that are new requirements and we are opening warning tasks for, it's really to increase awareness to the external assessor so that they may correct it in future submissions. The advantage of these early warning tasks is that the assessor is made aware, but also has no additional action items other than to acknowledge and return the task to HITRUST that yes, they did get that, they understood it, and sent the task back to HITRUST. We also welcome feedback if the assessor has additional information that can provide clarification or feedback or questions. Once they get these early warning tasks, please go ahead and send those. But overall, it's not the QA approach I'm speaking of is not very new. A lot of what we'll be doing is what we are already doing with the requirements we've already presented. For the few that you'll find are new within the assessment handbook, you'll get that grace period and warning tasks to allow you to prepare before we expect fully compliance after April 16th. So that covers the HITRUST QA approach section. I believe we have next steps, and I'll turn that back to Vincent.
Thanks, Anna. So what are the next steps with the assessment handbook? You can go to the next slide, then. So as you're reviewing the handbook, we do encourage organizations and external assessors to provide any feedback that they want to give to HITRUST related to assessment handbook, as well as any questions that you have on the criteria that we've outlined in the handbook. We would ask you to submit that feedback to this support email at support@hitrustalliance.net, and it'll get routed to the right place within HITRUST to get a response. If it's feedback, we'll take it into consideration for any future versions of the handbook itself. So when HITRUST does determine that additions or modifications are necessary for a handbook, I wanted to outline the process that's going to be followed. First of all, they'll either be versioned as either a major version change, which would move it from version 1.1.0, which it's on right now, to a 2.0 release, or a minor version change, which would move it from that version 1.0 to a version 1.1 release. The difference between a major change and a minor change would be major changes include changes to the current rules or expectations that an organization or their assessor are following as far as the assessment process or any certification rules themselves. So anything that would require a period to adapt to, that would be considered a major change. A minor version change would be an addition to the appendix. So that would be when we want to provide some additional clarity or answer some common questions that have been coming up. We'll include those in the appendix, but those would be considered a minor version change because it's not changing any of the rules or criteria for performing an assessment, but it's providing some additional examples and information to the community. Also, any informational changes, perhaps related to the different assessment types or any wording changes in the handbook, minor wording changes that don't impact the rules themselves, those would be considered minor version changes. We'll communicate those version changes out to the community, and it'll for at least major version changes, it'll include a notice period prior to final publication. The length of that notice period really is based on the significance and impact of that change to the community. So if we're adding additional examples to the appendix, those themselves may not include a notice period, since it's not really necessary to have that notice period in place. You can go to the next slide, Dennis. So I want to cover a few key dates related to the handbook itself. So as I mentioned, any questions can be submitted to our support email. And as Ida mentioned earlier, all criteria must be met for submitted assessments as of April 16th. We do have some additional assessment handbook webinars coming up. Next Tuesday, December 12th, we're going to cover Chapter 7 in the handbook related to scoping a HITRUST assessment. In this chapter, we're going to cover the differences between a primary and secondary scope of assessment and what you need to take into account when testing various requirements based on the scope of the assessment. And then in January, we have three more webinars coming up. January 9th, we are going to cover Chapter 12, which is leveraging reliance in your HITRUST assessment. So on top of inheritance, we're also going to cover some of the other ways that you can rely on the work of others within a HITRUST assessment. On January 16th, we're going to cover chapters 8.3 and chapters 11. And this is really focused towards the external assessor or internal assessor community to help provide detailed information on the testing and evidence expectations that HITRUST has. And then January 23rd, we're going to cover Chapter 15, which I mentioned earlier, around reporting and maintaining a HITRUST certification. So thanks, everyone, for attending. Now, I want to turn it over to questions that everyone has about the handbook overview and next steps.
Thanks, Vincent. We did have a few questions come in, and give me just a minute here. Let me get these arranged, and we will start addressing these. Okay. Give me just a second here. You may see a bit of a blip in the screen here. So the first question I had come in, and we have several good questions. Thank you for your input. I didn't get a chance to respond back in the chat. But the first thing I had come in, is the audience for the handbook primarily for the assessors or for the assessor organizations? So Vinny, do you want to grab that one?
Yes, thanks, Dennis. So I really believe there's important content in the handbook for both parties all throughout. So for organizations, it's really important for them to understand their role as an assessed entity before starting an engagement, and understanding the assessment workflow along with the phases where they're responsible. Understand the expectations HITRUST has for their external assessor, so they know what may be asked of them from their assessor. For the external assessor, they do probably have a larger responsibility in understanding the handbook. They should have a comprehensive understanding of it to both guide the customer and understand what HITRUST expects throughout the assessment and certification processes.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Thank you. So the next one we had in, and this one's going to kind of feed into a couple of related questions around the timing of the handbook enforcement, things like that. But basically, if they don't fully understand something that is presented in the handbook, where can they go for additional interpretation and assistance?
Dennis, I can take that one.
Awesome.
In situations where you have any questions or you need additional clarification, remember the goal is to ensure that we are not having different interpretations. From the assessment handbook, please reach out to us via email to our support queue, and they route that to us, and we'll provide the additional information. If you don't know the email is support@HITRUSTalliance.net, and it will be routed to us. So it's a workflow system, so it doesn't just go sit in a queue somewhere. So just feel free to reach out, even with any feedback, not just questions for clarification.
All right, appreciate that, Ida.
And
I'm going to address one live really.
This ties into also a question I see in the chat. Those early warnings are great. What if you don't have an assessment going on during the early warning period? After April 16th, will HITRUST give a little rope to assessors that may not have fully understood a new criteria? I think this is situational, depending on what criteria wasn't met. Again, I think as we mentioned earlier, a large majority of the guidance in the handbook has been previously communicated, but we are open to discussing the situation and any misunderstandings with the assessors. Of course, if it directly impacts scoring, there would be a remediation required, as it does now. But we're willing, after April 16th, have some discussions with assessors to make corrections for assessments going forward.
Thanks, Vinny. And I answered this one in chat, and I'm also going to just reiterate. So this session was recorded, and so it'll take a few days to get the recordings done and everything reproduced for the web page. For those of you who registered, you can go to the main web page, and probably Monday we'll have this done. You'll be able to download or view the recording and grab the slide deck. It will be made available to all attendees. Okay, sorry, Benny, didn't mean to cut in there. The other one I wanted to hit, and we've had a couple of questions on this, is we mentioned versioning changes to the handbook. How does one go about addressing those changes and putting in requests for modifications?
So I would submit that feedback also the same way you would submit any questions. You can submit it to the support group at support@HITRUSTalliance.net, and it'll get routed to the department responsible for that part of the handbook to review and see if we need to make some updates in future versions or provide some clarification to the assessor. There's no limit to the feedback period. So it's really ongoing. As you see things in the handbook, we're open to feedback at any time.
Okay, thanks, Vinny. And then this one we've kind of talked through, but I'll go ahead and just go ahead and read it. Is there going to be any change to the QA approach after implementation of the handbook on 16 April 2024?
Dennis, I can take that one. And this is more a recap of what I mentioned earlier. A lot of the enforcement that now is referenced in the assessment handbook is what we've already been, the requirements that were part of the assurance program requirements and other documentation. We've just consolidated them into the assessment handbook. So most of this is not new, but we will continue to open tasks. For those things that we know are probably new and the assessors may not have seen us push back before, we'll provide those early tasks, early warning tasks, just to make them aware. So no, the QA approach will not be changing after April 16th. We are just enhancing it to make sure we are providing a reference in the assessment handbook, and also we are including that in the tasks. And most of what the feedback you'll be getting, majority of it is not new.
All right. And we had a comment in here that they lost audio when the QA began. It will include the QA portion on the recording. Okay. I'm going to go to the presenters here really quickly. Do you guys have anything else that we wanted to hit before we close out the session?
No, I just want to thank everyone for attending. As a reminder, the easiest way to access the handbook, if you're looking for it real quickly, you just go to HITRUSTAlliance.net homepage, and under resources, it's the third link. So it's real easy to get to.
Okay. Thanks, Vinny. Okay, so thank you for attending the webinar. If you have any questions, please contact your HITRUST customer support manager or HITRUST support, and we will be happy to assist you with anything you may need. The presentation and recording will be available on the HITRUST website here in a few days. Like I said, we should be able to get it done by the beginning of next week. Appreciate all your time today. Thank you and have a great day.